Hi, I'm Andrew Rodriguez, and welcome to PsychoBible, babbling about psychology and theology. The idea for today's video came from a Facebook friend who asked, has anyone spoken about the brokenness or brokenness, I couldn't tell because she only used one N, of wokeness? So I asked, do you mean brokenness or brokeness? And she said both. And that got me thinking. And thinking, I'm like, well, there's my next video. See, there's a brokenness in wokeness, in woke ideology, and it's a brokenness that is both it's psychological, philosophical, and theological. And there's a brokenness. I mean, you've heard the saying, get woke, go broke. Referring to companies trying to brand themselves as woke and all for social justice, and whether you're talking about feminism or Black Lives Matter or LGBT stuff, there's all these companies now that are organizations that are trying to rebrand themselves and look like they're on the right side of history. Well, as they do that, then they lose like half their audience or their customers, and they're massively losing profits. Just look at what happened to Gillette after that one ad attacking toxic masculinity, which was really just attacking pretty much men. See, this wokeness, this social justice ideology, this politically correct ideology, Marxism, it doesn't produce, it only destroys. We're seeing this in the riots. You don't see them creating anything, you see them just destroying things. So you see that it doesn't create, it kills. Look at how much the left has made abortion the issue that they will die on, the hill they'll die on. So it doesn't create, it's all about, it's a culture of death. It's like I've been saying in my series on social issues through a theology body lens. We're now seeing a culture of death. Once you separate spirit from body, it doesn't give life. It only steals. There's nothing giving in this philosophy, this mentality. It's one that is always about taking. This brokenness, it's a poverty of proper individuation and maturation. This brokenness is what produces the brokenness in wokeness. And the longer these riots persist and more of these PC, politically correct authoritarians are given a platform, the more their true colors emerge. Like I say as a therapist, when I got a client who I'm just meeting them, they're talking and talking, and like, am I talking too much? I'm like, keep talking. You're giving me all sorts of information. So, on one hand, unfortunately, the more they talk, the more they indoctrinate, but also the more their nature becomes apparent. Let's start at the root, the theology and philosophy. This is a pagan system. I would say godless, but that's not quite true. There is a God involved. It's the God of this world that's behind it. Heck, some of Black Lives Matter's leaders are calling on spirits to aid them in their fight. So you see, it's got very pagan roots. It's got mystic roots and occultic roots. It is a diabolic philosophy. Remember, diabolic means to divide, to rupture. It results only in division and conflict because it is designed to do so. It's not about racial reconciliation or reconciliation of the genders. It is about war between the genders, war between the races, or really there's only one race, but whatever. There's some racial differences between the humanity, and it's all about expounding on them and making them the most important trait that a person could have. This is critical theory. It's the bedrock of Marxism, dressed up in a pop culture garb. I remember coming across it, not for the first time, but really thinking about this more earnestly in 2016. I was just finishing up my multicultural therapy course, learning about privilege and microaggressions, and with the election heating up, I was seeing so many of my friends online claiming to be woke. Of course, as a grammar cop, or should I say grammar Nazi, should that'll probably get me censored. I hear woke, I just hate the sound of it right away. I'm like, woke, that's not even proper English. I'm like, you mean awakened? Awakened to what? According to them, they're awakened, or they're woke, to all the systemic injustice and oppression in society, or in the West, in the evils of capitalism. But as I looked into all these claims about police shootings and immigration, I was seeing what the claims were really based on. What I was seeing was that my friends were being duped, indoctrinated into a social justice ideology that places identity entirely into groups, and one's value is based on victimization or marginalization, and which that can then be defined as simply living in any way outside the norms of society, or just humanity in general. The locus of control in this worldview is completely external. And then in the church, I put the blame on the obsession with being culturally relevant. Look, that topic deserves its own video. I'm going to get to it, but here's the gist. Once you're more concerned about how non-believers view you than you are about being doctrinally faithful, about the Great Commission to evangelize and disciple all nations, expanding the kingdom of God, you've set yourself up to be blown around by the constantly shifting ideas of depraved minds. And the enemy's got his counterfeits. He cannot create anything. The best he can do is corrupt or copy what God has established, what God has created. So now we've got major leaders in the church, whether Catholic, like Father James Martin and all the Jesuits, mainline, which historically the mainline has always been pretty loose in their doctrine and not too biblically faithful. But now you got it coming into the evangelical world, what we call Big Eva. You see it in the corruption of the Gospel Coalition, in the Southern Baptists. It's happening. You see it in Revoice. They're buying into the world's philosophy. Now here's A.D. Robles dropping truth on the whole idea of the woke church.
Here's my thread about the woke church and why it is that it's so crazy, it's so upside down, and why I think it's not a Christian movement in any way. So I'll read my own thread and I'll provide some commentary on it. We did that last week. It worked out pretty well, so we'll do it again. So this Sunday morning, I wrote this. I said this: the woke church is a hate-filled church, which means it's not a Christian church by any means. What I don't mean is angry-sounding words and rhetoric, though obviously they have their fair share of that too. What I do mean, though, is hate in a technical, biblical sense. Wokeness is hatred. And to step out of the thread for a second, I really do mean this. I don't mean angry words or animus in your heart, although that's definitely part of wokeness. But what I mean is hate as the opposite of biblical love. So God says that if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. And so the two greatest commandments we know from Christ are love the Lord your God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. You know what I mean? And so anything that goes contrary to the law of God is technically hatred. And so I saw somebody tweet this out the other day, to love someone properly, to love your neighbor as yourself, you need to obey the commandments of God. That's part and parcel of a Christian mindset, right? We should all believe that. And so therefore, when an LGBT person says they love their partner that they're having sex with or cuddling with or encouraging in their sin, then they're actually using a counterfeit version of love. In fact, from a Christian perspective, that love is actually hatred. That's what we need to believe, because if the law of God shows us how to love, the love of Christ, the law of Christ, right, shows us how to love, then the opposite of the law of God would have to be hatred. So that's what I'm talking about here. And I think that the woke church preaches a message and has doctrine that is contra almost every single commandment of God. And that is one very easy way for you to know that the woke church is actually not a Christian church. It's a hate-filled movement. Here's how I continue. I say, think about all the bearing of false witness you have heard from the woke. It never ends. Racist motives and actions are assumed as part of the system without and sometimes even contrary to the evidence. And that is hatred in a very deeply biblical sense. Now, what I had in mind was that thread from Ibram X. Kendi, whatever his name is, who was saying that, white people, racist white people adopt black people all the time because they just want to essentially get the blackness out of them because they hate them, and so they adopt black children. They give them a home, they parent them, they provide for them because they're racist and they hate them. And then later people were pushing back on that, and he said, see, the pushback means that it's true. And it's like, that's actually literally bearing false witness. You have no evidence that this Catholic woman is racist in any way. You have no evidence that anyone's racist. You're just outright saying it. They're racist, and they're still racist even if they have black children, even if they love their black children, or they say they love their black children. Even if they don't, even if they do, it doesn't matter what their response is. All of that's going to be evidence for Ibram X. Kendi, because he's crazy. All of that's going to be evidence of racism. It doesn't matter what your reaction is. That's the whole project of white fragility and white supremacy. And so if you notice, people in the woke church often will say so-and-so is racist without any evidence, and again, sometimes contrary to the evidence. That's bearing false witness. Here's how I continue. I say covetousness, stealing. They also find their way into core woke church tenets. This is found in the constant references to wealth, property, income. The woke church cultivates and baptizes a desire for you to get what your neighbor owns. This is hatred at its deepest levels. And this is definitely true. You always talk about, well, the evidence of racism is that white people have more stuff than black people. And we need some of that stuff. That's our stuff. We need to take some of that stuff. And you need to give us reparations, and we need to tax some of that stuff away from you to give it to us. And this whole thing, like your politics on economics and social policies is nothing more than what your actual desires are, your actual ethics and morality is, played out on a public scale. And so when you desire to see the rich taxed so that you could have more, that's just covetousness and stealing working its way out in your politics. That's what that is. And so much of woke church doctrine either wants to make that somewhat acceptable or outright says it's required to love your neighbor.
I don't have time to get into all the examples that are out there, but I'm literally seeing pastors using books like White Fragility or How to Be Anti-Racist, or they're using material by James Martin and his LGBT Catholic ministry, or Revoice, which has only part of the gospel. They're calling people of same-sex attraction to some form of repentance, but they're denying the power of God to bring healing and change. And so I'm seeing pastors promote these voices, but not the voices that are actually working toward real reconciliation, real transformation, real change in people's lives. So what are we seeing? This movement in the church isn't the result of a deep study of the scriptures, but of adoption of critical theory and Marxist philosophy. It's explicitly anti-Christian. And these people are trying to marry the two. That's what we call syncretism. And the philosophy itself is broke. It has a poverty of sound reasoning and research. It's completely ignorant of human nature. I mean, talk to any Marxist or socialist who thinks that, this hasn't worked in the past. We haven't tried true communism. We haven't tried true socialism. All those things from the 21st century, or the USSR and Cuba and Cambodia and communist China, those weren't real communism. It's like they are just either ignorant or they know exactly what they're doing. They think they can actually create utopia if they can just control all the variables. It's a recipe for dystopia. So they're either completely ignorant of how humans work. Like humans, we need incentive. We have a desire to produce for ourselves, for our family, for our tribe, for our children, for the next generation. You can't just take that away. You can't just say, well, we're against the nuclear family. Black Lives Matter. We want to dismantle it so that children are more just a property of the state. No individual property is allowed. That's what they're all about. They don't want you to feel like you have any ownership over yourself, your home, your spouse, your kids. Those are all incidental, that the state can choose to take them away. So, I mean, ultimately, that's where it's going. So they think that they can enact these sort of policies where the state controls everything, but that's completely ignorant of how humans work. We're going to rebel against that. And so it's just going to bring more conflict. Or they are fully aware and their intentions are not nearly as noble as they claim. They know this will lead to conflict, and perpetual conflict at that. I actually think it's a combination of both. There are those who want to destroy everything and usher in a new tyranny, and there are those who just go along because they believe they're being compassionate and they have some idiosyncratic or really a narcissistic drive to please everyone and thus be needed. That they have a drive to be the one who cares for others. And the research actually leads to this idea. When I discovered Jordan Peterson in September of 2016, and I saw him standing up to the leftists in academia and the state, it was a breath of fresh air. And I was even more thrilled when he showed that he and his students had been researching for quite some time the psychology of these politically correct, social justice warrior, postmodern neo-Marxists.
We kind of know some of the answers to that. I don't want to make too grandiose a claim, but I've done some research with my graduate students on political correctness per se, because we've been interested in the personality predictors of political belief. It really does turn out that you vote your personality far more than you think, because like what you think is that you look at the world and there's a landscape of facts and you view the facts objectively and you derive your conclusions. And the thing is, it doesn't really work that way because there's just too damn many facts, right? And so you can't even really get an unbiased sample of them. What happens is that your personality works as a filtering mechanism so that certain things stand out for you more than other things. And so some things stand out more for the people on the radical left, and some things stand out for people who are liberal, and some things stand out for people who are conservative. And then everyone says, well, look, I'm looking at the facts and I'm drawing this conclusion. It's like, yeah, but what you don't understand is you're not looking at the same set of facts, and you can't even, and that's why you have to actually engage in dialogue with other people, because they'll expose you to their set of facts. I'm not saying that facts don't exist or that they're relativistic or anything like that. One of the things we found out about the politically correct types is that they're high in a trait called agreeableness. Now, you might think, really? That isn't what I would have guessed. But agreeableness is a maternal trait. And women are higher in agreeableness than men. That's cross-cultural. And that difference really seems to start manifesting itself primarily at puberty. And so agreeableness is likely the trait that stops you from throwing your baby out the window at 3 in the morning when it's had colic for 3 hours and you haven't had any sleep and you're not in very good shape and you just got laid off. It's like it's a very, very tight bonding mechanism. And so what happens, it's primarily driven by what you might describe as compassion. Now, compassion is great for dealing with infants, and maybe it's great for dealing with hurt people and really elderly people. It's good for taking care of people who can't take care of themselves, but it's not a great doctrine to be building a political system on. And so one of the things that happens with the more politically correct types by temperament is that they suffer from an excess of impulsive compassion, and they assume that if there's an inequitable distribution of anything, that the people who are at the bottom are all victims who should be treated like infants, and that everyone at the top is a vicious snake-like predator. And that's hardwired in some sense. Now, it's a very popular story. It's the fullest story. Yeah, of course. Of course. It's an easy story to sell, and there's some truth in it. But some truth isn't the same as all the truth. And so what you see, at least in part, is undifferentiated empathy. And that's not a virtue. It's not a virtue. You have to think. You can't just feel. You have to think. And, even when you're taking care of kids, part of what you're doing is being compassionate. But if you're too compassionate towards your kids, then you do everything for them. And if you do everything for them, then they grow up useless and they never leave and they hate you and they hate everything else too. It's a bad idea. And so you use compassion judiciously. There's a rule if you're working in a place like a nursing home. And the rule is, it's a harsh rule, do not do anything for the people that you're taking care of that they can do for themselves. And so if they have to struggle to feed themselves, you don't bloody well intervene and feed them. You let them maintain their damn independence. And you have to be a hard-hearted bastard to do that. to watch someone struggle like that. But you're furthering their medium to long-term independence and development, and you do the same thing with your children. Treating your children like they're endless permanent victims is a very bad idea. And I think that's part of what's also being taught. We also know that the kids who are more likely to be rabidly politically correct, one of the reasons that they're more likely to be that way is because they were taught to be that way. We found that even exposure to a single lecture that was associated with the politically correct dogmatic structure was enough to tilt people in that direction. So there's a temperamental proclivity, and then there's failure of education to address that, and then there's the exacerbation and exaggeration by the people who are trying to produce like activists by proxy. One of the most appalling things I saw, for example, at McMaster, when I went to McMaster and got yelled down by profanity shouting people who had the bloody gall to hide behind a banner that had a hammer and sickle on it, for God's sake. If the Nazis would have been out there with their swastika, there would have been hell to pay, but because it was the hammer and sickle, it's like, it's okay. There's nothing wrong with being a communist. It's like, sorry about the 200 million dead people, folks. So they're out there, hiding behind this banner. None of the people who were teaching them were out there. They bailed out of the damn discussion, right? Because there were 4 people who were supposed to talk with me there. They all vanished. They leave these student proxies to go out there and do their dirty work. It's really contemptible. So you can lay a fair bit of the blame at the feet of the people who are supposed to be educating them, but that are instead indoctrinating them. So that's what it looks like to me.
In a study done by one of his students, Andary-Brophy, they found 2 types of politically correct people: the PC egalitarians and PC authoritarians. What they both share in common is being high in the trait of agreeableness. Peterson clarifies that this is a maternal trait. So of course we see it more in females. And I would say we also see it in males who have not made the developmental transition or initiation into identifying more with the masculine. Instead, we see it a lot in the more effeminate males, the passive males, beta males, as you may hear them being called. They have some sort of sense of a masculine deficit. And you think, well, they're just impotent then. But no, what you see of these passive men are really quite dangerous. I got into that in my video about Cobra Kai. What differentiates the PC egalitarians and the PC authoritarians are a couple traits. The main one is verbal cognitive ability. Now, what is verbal cognitive ability? Cognitive ability is a measure for effective decision-making, accurate and proficient performance, reasoning skill, problem-solving, and tactful response to complex or novel situations. Basically, it's IQ. Verbal cognitive ability is how well one can gather, analyze, and understand information in the form of language. Spoken word, written word, how well they can argue their points. Someone high in verbal cognitive ability or verbal reasoning can understand other points of view and make a case for their own side using logically consistent arguments. So the difference is the PC authoritarians are low in verbal cognitive ability. The egalitarians are high in verbal cognitive ability. And even then, I would take that with a grain of salt. When I was fighting my expulsion in graduate school, the arguments the school was using were just laughable and entirely unfounded and unsupported by research. I mean, you would think these people with their doctorates and running a university would know when they're making an argument that makes no sense. But apparently a lot of smart people are not that smart. You see it with the APA and the propaganda they're putting out. Perhaps the bar is so low in academia that there are quite a few low IQ authoritarians doing the teaching and administrating. Or they knew exactly what they were doing and they thought they could just gaslight me like they do every other student. Well, I was one that was not so easily indoctrinated. But anyway, if the PC authoritarians are low in verbal reasoning, then I think that explains all the rioters. They're not rational. Look at them. The points they're making are nonsensical. Their demands are unreasonable. they're throwing giant temper tantrums after being triggered by some news report that the media knows will set them off. And every new report the media puts out just incites them again, just after things calm down. They're so easily played and manipulated. And it explains how social media is not the best place to go for nuanced discussion of complex issues. I won't even bother with Twitter. It's such a dumpster fire. Heck, check out the rant video I did about so-called conversion therapy. My old college buddy made no sense in his points. Everything he was saying was full of logical fallacies and emotional reasoning. You could watch Benjamin Boyce's videos exposing Evergreen University. Their arguments and behavior are just infantile. And so what I see happening is the PC authoritarians are pulling down the structures of society in order to get their way. They are full of hate and covetousness. And the PC egalitarians hear their pleas, hear them claiming that they're in distress, and their motherly instincts take over. Because if you're a mother, the baby is always right. Baby can't quite articulate. Baby has very low cognitive ability, or very low verbal cognitive ability. Baby is pre-verbal, so just crying indicates the baby's in distress. And so no matter what, the mom rushes to take care. But they're forgetting that we're not dealing with real babies. We're dealing with a minority, a racial minority, a sexual minority, are not babies. They're adults, and we need to treat them like adults. We need to demand and expect responsibility from them, and a demand that they present a logically consistent argument. But I see with so many of these liberals who have now just keep buying into whatever new rule that the politically correct gatekeepers put out there. I'm like, they don't really believe this stuff. I've seen friends completely switch sides on issues like homosexuality just because they're scared of offending the mob. They don't want to be on the wrong side of history. And so you see that they don't have any real convictions of their own. The PC egalitarians are also high in openness, meaning they're drawn toward experiences that are outside the norm. They're willing to explore all sorts of ideas. And as Peterson mentioned, they've often been exposed to at least one lecture or teaching on disparities between groups. That's all it takes for their maternal instincts to coddle and protect kick in. So once they're presented with some sort of group that seems to be helpless and is crying for attention, they redirect their urge to nurture toward them. It's some sort of sublimating of their urge to protect and care for. I think about just recently, like I'm doing online a training in a type of therapy approach for trauma, and it's all online, so it's on Zoom, and there's 13 of us. I'm the only male, and the women, half of them, out of a dozen of us, half of them put on their Zoom name, in parentheses, they'll include their pronouns. 10 years ago, they would not have cared. They wouldn't have thought to put their pronouns. It just shows that, oh, well, is this where we're going? Is this what's politically correct now? Okay, I'll do that now. They just, like sheep, will just do whatever they think it will take for them to be accepted. And then they can be viewed as someone who's caring and nurturing. And in some ways, the PC authoritarians really are like little kids. They have their demands, they don't know how, or they don't want to work to make their desires come true, especially with their low verbal cognitive ability, so they resort to protesting. What is protesting? When a baby protests, what is that? It's a cry. It's whining, it's complaining, but mostly it's going to be crying. So that's a form of protest. So they have their version of protesting in their adult version. So what is it? It's burning things, it's throwing things, it's chanting things, screaming things, crying, screaming at the sky. And the PC egalitarians hear their cries and rush to save them. It's a feminine way of handling the issue. It's like classic. And we used to say, well, wait until they get into the real world, when they're out of college and they're out of their gender studies classes and they have to get a real job with a boss and a structure and quotas and requirements. That's what we used to be able to say, but we forgot that, hey, whatever's in the universities will be in the real world 5 years later. And all the masculine aspects of society that ought to stir them on to make something of themselves and contribute to society, they're now instead being overrun by these feminine ways of handling issues as the companies go woke. And we have things like implicit bias training and diversity quotas and affirmative action. And we have all this shaming on social media if a company doesn't fit the mob's demands. They are literally trying to change everything to be equal in outcome. And that demand just doesn't fit reality. The only type of equality we should fight for and really demand is impartiality under the law, or whatever your corporate policy is, if we're not dealing with the state but dealing with the company. But just face it, we don't all start off with equal opportunity. And we're not going to arrive at equal outcomes. You can't force it to happen. If you do try to force it, it will be deadly. That's something I've had to come to accept. I wasn't born in a wealthy home or to a wealthy family, or I didn't have a lot of opportunities or advantages. Jesus said it himself, the poor you will always have with you. You're not going to have people starting off on equal footing, and not everyone's going to come out with the same outcome. It's just reality. So what business is it of mine what sort of privileges someone starts with in life? My concern is only for what I do with the opportunities and talents I have. And I will fight to make sure that I am treated fairly, as in I am treated with impartiality. But if I'm not treated perfectly fairly, I'm not going to make so many demands. I'm going to make opportunities for myself. I'm going to move on. I'm going to get a backbone and not demand that others take care of things for me. So my concern is only for what I do with the opportunities and talents I have, and make something with them that blesses others and glorifies God. Because ultimately, my reward isn't in this earth, in this life, on this earth. I'm working for rewards in the next one. God will settle all accounts in the end. But when you have this godless, materialist view of reality, everything's a zero-sum game. And speaking of this demand for equal outcomes, which is their distorted view of justice, let's move toward more of the psychological brokenness of wokeness. That demand for equality of outcome is indicative of one of the many cognitive distortions in social justice thinking, the fallacy of fairness. It's the irrational belief that life is meant to be fair and we're obligated to impose fairness upon life. Why else do we see so much anger coming from these radicals? Because when you hold on tightly to an expectation, a demand, that is not fitting the reality, it causes anger. This is one thing that Brooks Gibbs teaches with his emoji meter. The longer your cause has not been rectified, the more enraged you get. Now look at some of the most common cognitive distortions. You can easily see them represented in the woke mob. Magnification. That's where you overplay the importance of something. For example, the color of the little person in the traffic signal. That's now a racial thing. Because it's white, that's now racist. Traffic signals are racist. Or walk signs or do not walk signs are now racist. Catastrophizing, blowing negative experiences out of proportion. For example, claiming that certain words or ideas don't just offend you, but actually harm you. When you say things like, silence is violence, or your words are harming me, I need a safe space. That's catastrophizing. It's making something way bigger than it actually is. All or nothing, or absolute thinking. Like looking at things in absolute black or white. Just saying that is probably triggering. Categories. For example, you're either actively anti-racist or you're racist. There's no such thing as not racist, according to people like Ibram X. Kendi. There's emotional reasoning, presuming that my negative feelings expose the true nature of things, events, or people. So if I feel scared, then this really is dangerous. This was the argument used that came up in Bill C-16, that if I feel harmed, then you actually did harm me by not using my preferred pronouns. Your intent doesn't matter, just how the other person feels. In fact, this came up in my argument with my friend in my video about ranting about conversion therapy. He said he knows gays and who are scared for their lives. And I dared to challenge him on that. I'm like, well, based on what? The existence of a therapy for those who want it, but it isn't being imposed on anyone else? We're not forcing therapy on others. We just want to fight for the ability for people who want to explore their heterosexual potential or want to work on resolving their same-sex attractions to have the option of seeing a therapist. But no, just the existence of that therapy option is traumatic for people who just use emotional reasoning because they are scared, therefore it is dangerous. Everything he was doing in that argument with me was pure emotional reasoning. Labeling. This is when we attribute one's actions to one's identity or group rather than to specific behaviors that can be changed or to circumstances. So when we say that, oh, all white people are oppressors, the reason why you're saying that is because you're a white person. It works the other way too. It's all racist. So, of course you think that you're black, or of course you say that you're mixed race. You can't understand the struggle because you pass. You're white passing, or it's just all it does is doesn't look at people as individuals but just as a group. And then there's blame. We can go into more, but let's just end with blame. So we blame yourself. This is just, by definition, is when you blame yourself, but you exclude other ways, you overlook ways that you weren't entirely responsible. Or, this is really want to focus on, where you blame others while overlooking ways you contributed to a problem. So, for example, blaming everything on racists. And you can't look at the community for fear of blaming the victim. Maybe there's some ways that the community is bringing more police attention to themselves. Why don't we take responsibility for those things instead of just blaming the system, blaming all these things that are outside of ourselves? And what you're seeing there with all these cognitive distortions is reinforcement of an external locus of control. So one of the things I always teach my clients is there's two types of locus or loci of control. Now, locus means where something is located, and control is referring to where do you think control of your life is located? Internal or external? Internal meaning like I have the ability to control my life, my decisions, my thoughts, my emotions ultimately. But an external locus of control believes that no, the control of my life is not up to me. It's up to circumstances or other people, that they really have more power. All these outside forces are what controls me. And which of those two types of locus of control is most associated with mental illness, with greater depression and anxiety? Guess what? It's not the internal locus of control, it's the external. The more you're blaming these outside forces, and that, oh, it's not until we can get rid of all racism. I mean, good luck with that. People have a tendency to unite according to family, and then group, and tribe, and then the more we polarize, we're going to just unite over stupid, arbitrary things like skin color. You can't erase all racism, but really, our society has been the least racist it's ever been, and yet we've now become so obsessed with race. Not just race, for example, but We can go over so many examples. Humans are flawed. We're going to always have problems. You can't eradicate all of them in society. So if you're waiting until society totally changed for you to stabilize emotionally, it's never going to happen. But yet you're seeing whole therapeutic approaches like feminist therapists and social justice therapists who don't try to actually help people with their depression and their anxiety by empowering them, but by trying to enlist them in a social or cultural war. More on that in some future videos when I get into my critique of the different theoretical therapy approaches. So is it any wonder that another mark of PC authoritarians is the presence of an anxiety or mood disorder in either themselves or someone in their family, like an immediate family growing up? And another mark or distinguishing feature is high sensitivity to disgust. Disgust is a revulsion to anything that violates the group's norms. You see this for sure in honor-shame cultures. Once again, harkening back to one of my arguments that what we're seeing in this culture war, this rise of leftism and cultural Marxism, is the emergence of and really popularizing of honor-shame culture dynamics. So no wonder these individuals are constantly claiming being offended. It just indicates that they have deficient distress tolerance. So how does all of this originate? Well, as a psychodynamically trained and trauma-informed therapist, I think it's best to start with looking at the family of origin and attachment. In fact, a truly systems-oriented therapist would start there with the family instead of starting with the larger society, which is right now everything's focused on, the larger society is what's causing all these problems. But no, look at the family. Is there proper nurture and care? Is there both a mother and a father, a really masculine dad and a really feminine mom, raising their children in a balanced way? And is a child securely attached to those caregivers, first with mom? I mean, this is what Erik Erikson was talking about, and Freud. That's through the initial attachment with mom that a child gets their first sense of safety in the world and trust in the world. So when you're telling me you're constantly being triggered and you're constantly scared and you're suspicious of the intentions of others, I'm wondering how good an attachment you had with your mother. And then eventually with your father. Did your father instill courage in you and show you where your strength is and your abilities to take on problems? That's the role of a dad in both boys and girls. See, if someone had a secure attachment in childhood, they'll then grow to have a healthy ambivalence toward both parents because they know it's safe to view their parents in an accurate light. They will neither idealize their parents, think of them as perfect, nor will they just demonize their parents and vilify them. But they can see their parents accurately, both the good and the bad, and still accept them. See, I'm happy to say that I got to that point as a kid. Even though my parents had lots of problems, I could speak just matter-of-factly about them and yet still love them. Now, I had a real problem with this when I became an adult because my parents were so kind of old-fashioned in some ways that you never point out their problems. That's disrespectful. That's not showing reverence to your parents. And I'll just be like, I'm not going to do that. I'm just, like, yeah, you guys have your flaws. Let's be open about it. Like, it's reality. But it doesn't mean I don't love you. It doesn't mean I don't respect you either. And that I don't want you in my life. So a securely attached person will have no problem seeing both the good and the bad in their parents. Well, your relationship with your parents, especially your father, serves as your unconscious template for authority in general. For example, I am deeply patriotic. I love this country. Similarly, I'm honored to be a Christian. I love the church. I love my faith. But that doesn't mean I'm ignorant of the flaws in our country's history or in church history. I'm not one of those people who says, well, I'm not a Christian, I'm a Christ follower, because Christian has too many negative connotations. And I'm not one of those people who says, yeah, this country is terrible. It was racist and corrupt from the very beginning. No, this country was founded on very good principles, but the problem wasn't in the principles, it was in the execution and in the fidelity to those principles. And so part of our story is the working out of those and manifesting those principles that were first declared in the Declaration of Independence and in the Bill of Rights. So as someone securely attached to my country, to my family, to my church, I can research those things. I can research my country, I can research my church, and then speak about them plainly without feeling compelled to disavow or utterly reject them. Or to put on rose-colored glasses like some patriots and some Christians will do and say, like, no, we've done nothing wrong. I'm not going to accept anything. No, I can look at things realistically, but still associate myself with them. But what we see if these woke people is, I'll bet quite a few of them were raised by single moms. And so who became their daddy? The government. They became dependent on the state to provide everything for them, or they just had this worldview that that's what the role of government should be. It should be there to parent them and intervene and control everything. So when your government is your parent and you have an insecure attachment with your own parents, you either idealize or demonize. That's why the same woke people demand the state seize control in order to protect them from the coronavirus, and then vilify the entire history of the USA. It's like my same friends who viciously hate Trump also wanted the federal government to dictate how the whole country should live. They constantly claim the system is broken and it was founded on racist, sexist principles, and yet they also want the federal government to have more and more control over their lives. They don't see the cognitive dissonance there. They completely miss the irony of their demands. But of course, that could have been their low verbal cognitive ability. So, I'm not going to make any friends with this one, I guess, but or I might lose some, but I'm at the point where my tolerance for the insanity in our country and in our churches is very low. And you might be thinking, well, Andrew, you're a therapist. You should be more therapeutic. But therapist does not mean a coddler. It is not my job to coddle my patients, to coddle my clients. My job is to coach them, to train up, and to be able to conquer their demons, to fight their dragons, and win the treasure. So they're not going to get anywhere with me just coddling their cognitive distortions, their distorted worldview, and their emotional reasoning. I'm not going to affirm things that do not line up with reality. There's one thing I always tell my clients. My job is to help you live in reality. And so I will not validate a worldview, an ideology that is ultimately going to cause more brokenness in my clients and leave them more broke in the end. All right. If you've got any thoughts, please join me in the comments section. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, hit that bell for notifications. God bless.